He left one woman dead in her bed. Then he stole her car. Then he went to his girlfriend's business and tried to drag her into that stolen vehicle in broad daylight. When that failed, he drove away. Found another woman walking to work, lured her into the car, strangled her, dumped her, and then drove over her body again and again. All of that happened in a single day. And the man who did it had a name the internet would never stop repeating: Wade Wilson. Not the comic book anti-hero, not the fictional killer with punchlines and healing powers, the real one. And in Southwest Florida, on October 7th, 2019, that name stopped sounding like pop culture and started sounding like a death sentence. The reason this case exploded online is obvious. The name writes the headline for you. Marvel's Wade Wilson, Deadpool, is the wisecracking mercenary with the healing factor, the big mouth, and the dark humor. Marvel itself describes him as one of the most relentlessly wisecracking heroes in the universe. The real Wade Wilson had none of that fictional distance, none of that wink to the audience, none of the safety that comes with a character on a page. What he shared with Deadpool was a name. That was enough to turn a brutal double murder into a spectacle. But once you strip away the nickname and the internet obsession, what is left is much uglier. A man with a long history of violence. A man the court record shows was already on felony probation when he killed. A man whose defense later leaned heavily on evidence of childhood mental illness, paranoia, psychosis, substance abuse, head trauma, and involuntary psychiatric intervention. And a man who, according to the state's evidence, spent the morning of October 7th moving from one victim to the next with terrifying speed. Before the murders, there was already damage everywhere. Wilson had been adopted as a baby after his biological parents, both teenagers, gave him up. His biological father, Stephen Testaseca, later testified during the penalty phase that the adoption happened through church connections and that Wade was raised by Candy and Steve Wilson. Years later, when Testaseca re-entered his son's life, he did not step into a stable adult story. He stepped into chaos. By the time of trial, defense experts were describing a life marked by psychotic symptoms, delusions, paranoia, schizophrenia spectrum diagnoses, heavy drug use, repeated head injuries, and a history of psychiatric intervention dating back to childhood. But the prosecution never denied that Wade Wilson had problems. The prosecution's position was more chilling than that. Their point was that whatever was wrong with him, it did not stop him from planning, lying, stealing, improvising, manipulating, fleeing, confessing, and then trying to undo those confessions later. Their rebuttal expert did not agree that Wilson had a psychotic disorder or frontal lobe brain damage, and the court, in the end, gave little or limited weight to much of the mitigation the defense offered. That matters, because this is not one of those cases where the facts disappear into theory. The facts stayed sharp, the timeline stayed sharp, and the bodies stayed at the center of it. So let's go there. Back to the night of October 6th, 2019. Kristine Melton and her friend Stephanie Johnson, later Stephanie Sailors, left Melton's apartment in Cape Coral and went to the Buddha, a bar in Fort Myers. Wade Wilson was there too. So was his girlfriend, Melissa Montanez. That night, Wilson introduced himself to Melton and Johnson using a fake name, J.R. It sounded harmless. It sounded casual. It sounded like the kind of lie people tell in bars and nobody remembers the next day. But that fake name was the first warning, because everything after that was built on deception. Inside the bar, Melton and Johnson also met another man, Jason Shepard. When the bar closed, the four of them decided to keep the night going. That is how quickly normal life can turn. A woman meets a man in a bar, a friend is there, another guy is there. An after-party gets mentioned. Nobody sees a death sentence in that moment. But that is exactly what it was. Wilson did not have permission to take Montanez's Dodge Hellcat, and he could not even drive it properly because it was a stick shift. So he tossed the keys to Shepard, and Shepard drove the group to his house. There, people drank, talked, and stayed up into the early morning. At some point, Wilson and Kristine Melton had consensual sex. Nothing in the record suggests she believed she was in immediate danger. Nothing suggests she thought she had just invited a killer into her orbit. Eventually, Shepard wanted everyone gone. So the night moved again. They headed back out. Because Wilson could not drive the Hellcat, they had to call an Uber. They were delayed while looking for Wilson's missing phone. Then Wilson, Melton, and Johnson made their way to Melton's apartment in Cape Coral. Johnson stayed only briefly. She had a child to drop off and work to get to, so she left. And that was the last time she saw her friend alive. Inside that apartment, after Johnson left, Wilson and Melton had sex again. Then he killed her, not by accident, not in panic, not in some blur the record could not explain. He strangled her to death. Later evidence showed he did more than that. The autopsy documented extensive bruising, internal injuries, deep hemorrhaging in the neck structures, trauma to the scalp, swelling in the brain consistent with concussive injury, and injuries to internal organs. Kristine Melton was not simply choked. She was violently overpowered and fatally asphyxiated in her own home. And then Wilson stayed. That detail is important. He did not run instantly. He remained in the apartment long enough to try to manage the scene. According to the evidence later presented in court, he wrapped Melton's body in clothing and bedding, planning to move her to the trunk of her car. But he could not lift her, so he left her where she was and stole her black Nissan Versa instead. By the time police found her, her body was still inside the apartment, bundled on the floor. When investigators pulled the sheets and clothes away, they exposed a leg and its tattoo. That was how Kristine Melton was found. By then, though, Wade Wilson had already moved into the next phase. He had left his own phone behind at Shepard's house the night before. So now, he used Kristine Melton's phone. He called Melissa Montanez from Melton's number. He texted her. He used the dead woman's phone to continue managing the chaos he was creating in real time. Montanez did not immediately understand what had happened. She only knew Wilson wanted to see her, and she wanted her car back. They arranged to meet at her business in Fort Myers, Mila's salon. When Melissa got there, she expected one thing. Instead, she saw Wade sitting in a car she did not recognize. It was not her Hellcat. It was Kristine Melton's stolen Nissan. That alone should have told her the day had already gone badly wrong, but she still did not know Kristine Melton was dead. She approached the car and tried to talk to him. Wilson told her to get inside. She refused. What happened next became a critical hinge in the entire case. He attacked her. He grabbed her. He tried to force her into the car. He punched her. He choked her. He fought her outside her own business in broad daylight. Melissa later told police she believed that if he had gotten her into that car, she would have died. And that belief matters because she was not imagining his capacity for murder anymore. At that point, he had already killed once. People called 911. Police started responding. And this is where the timeline becomes almost unbearable. Because while the first murder was still unknown to police, and while Melissa Montanez had just survived a violent attack, Wilson drove away again. He could have stopped. He could have run. He could have hidden. He could have ditched the car and disappeared. Instead, according to the record, he made a decision that would later become one of the most devastating facts in the penalty phase. He decided that, because he had already killed one woman, he might as well kill another. That second woman was Diane Ruiz. She was 43 years old. She was walking to work at the Moose Lodge in Cape Coral. She was not partying. She was not flirting with strangers. She was not taking risks in a bar at 2 a.m. She was just living her ordinary life. Wilson pulled over and asked her for directions to a nearby school. She told him where it was. He pretended not to understand. Then he convinced her to get inside the car and show him. That was the trap. That was the moment her day ended. Once Diane Ruiz was in the vehicle, Wilson attacked her. He strangled her while driving. At some point, he realized she was not dead. He kept driving, looking for a place to dump her. He strangled her more than once. Then he pushed her body from the car into an empty lot. And when he realized she was still alive, he got back behind the wheel and ran over her body repeatedly. Not once, repeatedly. Later, Wilson described it to his biological father in language so grotesque it has become inseparable from this case. He said he kept running her over until she looked like spaghetti. Testaseca testified that Wilson did not sound horrified by what he had done. He sounded energized by it, almost proud. Diane Ruiz fought for her life. The autopsy showed bruising to her hands and forearms consistent with defensive injuries. It showed crushing force to her chest, numerous rib fractures, neck injuries classic for strangulation, fractures to structures in the throat, and injuries consistent with being run over by a vehicle while alive for at least part of the assault. This was not an instantaneous death. This was a sequence. First, the lure, then the choking, then the dumping, then the realization that she was still alive, then the final brutality. By now, Wilson had killed 2 women in a matter of hours, and yet the day still was not over. He drove to Mateo Graphics in Fort Myers, where Joshua Lukic saw him arrive in the Nissan. Wilson was shirtless, shoeless, bloody, panicked, desperate to leave town. He asked for a plane ticket, a bus ticket, anything. Then he said the words that made Lukic understand he was not dealing with a man in ordinary trouble. Wilson said he had killed people. At first, Lukic tried to keep him calm. Then he did something that may have saved another life. He lied. He told Wilson he needed to go pick someone up. Instead, he got out and called police. That one call mattered, because outside Mateo Graphics sat Kristine Melton's Nissan Versa. Police processed it. Inside, they found blood. They found registration papers. They linked the vehicle back to Melton, and that link sent them to her home. Up until that point, the officers chasing Wilson mainly knew about the assault on Melissa Montanez. Now they were walking into a murder scene. A bundle of sheets and clothing lay inside the apartment. A leg with a tattoo was visible. Kristine Melton was dead. At the same time, another thread of the case was quietly tightening. A parent at a school found a purse. Inside was Diane Ruiz's identification. An officer called her phone over and over and got no answer. Police learned she had not shown up for work, something co-workers said was deeply out of character. Then, while officers searched, a circling vulture drew attention to a nearby area. That is where Diane Ruiz's body was found. So now the pieces were coming together. A violent assault outside a salon, a stolen Nissan, a dead woman in an apartment, a missing woman whose purse had been found, a suspect moving frantically across the area, confessing in pieces to multiple people. And then came the phone calls to his biological father. Those calls changed everything. At first, Stephen Testaseca thought this was another one of Wade's dark performances. He had known him long enough to believe he was capable of spinning ugly stories. But the details became too specific, too real. Wade said he had done something he could not undo. He said 2 people were gone and not coming back. He called himself a killer. He described the first woman from the bar, strangled after she fell asleep. He described wrapping her body. Then he described the second woman, the one he picked up for directions, the one he strangled, the one he ran over. At some point in that conversation, Testaseca stopped hearing a story. He started hearing a confession. And then he made the decision that helped end the manhunt. He asked Wade where he was, not because he was going to save him, because he was going to give him up. Testaseca told Wilson he would send an Uber and needed the address. Wilson gave it. Testaseca and his wife relayed the address and details of the confessions to law enforcement. Police surrounded the house where Wilson had broken in and was hiding. Officers used a loudspeaker. They called the house phone. Wilson said he wanted to speak to his father one more time. His father told him to come out. He did. Even then, the case kept getting worse. The evidence was not just testimonial, it was physical. Florida Department of Law Enforcement analysts found Wilson's DNA on the bedding and clothing wrapped around Kristine Melton's body. Blood in Melton's car linked back to Diane Ruiz. A curtain rod from Melton's apartment carried biological evidence tying Wilson directly to the scene. Police also had Wilson's own admissions to detectives after his arrest, in which he identified both women and described what he had done. By the time the state brought the case to trial, this was not a murder case resting on one confession. It was a case built out of witness testimony, forensic pathology, physical evidence, vehicle evidence, phone evidence, and multiple admissions. Then came the courtroom phase. And time mattered here, because the murders happened in 2019. But the trial did not start until June 2024. That gap stretched the pain for the families of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz. It also gave Wilson years to transform his image. By the time he appeared in court, he looked very different from the man those women had met in October 2019. He had acquired heavy facial tattoos and a far more theatrical appearance. The internet took that image and turned it into content. But in the courtroom, the state kept forcing the focus back where it belonged, not on his face, not on his name, not on the viral obsession, but on what he did to those two women. On June 12, 2024, the jury convicted him. 2 counts of first-degree murder, and also grand theft of a motor vehicle, battery, burglary of a dwelling, and petty theft. That part was over. But in Florida capital cases, a conviction is not the end of the story. Then came the penalty phase. The state argued aggravation, and the aggravation was enormous. For Kristine Melton's murder, the jury found that Wilson was under felony probation when he killed, had prior violent felony history, and that the murder was heinous, atrocious, or cruel. For Diane Ruiz's murder, they found those aggravators too. And one more: cold, calculated, and premeditated. That last aggravator says a lot about how the second killing was viewed. Diane Ruiz was not killed in the same burst of violence as Kristine Melton. She was killed after the first murder, after the attack on Melissa, after time to think, after time to stop. And he did it anyway. The defense tried to save him with mitigation. They presented evidence of psychosis, schizophrenia spectrum disorders, paranoia, delusions, childhood mental deterioration, substance abuse, repeated head injuries, involuntary psychiatric intervention, and a long history of psychiatric medication. They tried to argue that the man who killed Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz was not fully understandable outside that context. But the court did not find that context weighty enough. Some mitigation got some weight, some got little weight. A lot of it failed to move the balance. In the end, the aggravation swallowed the mitigation. On August 27, 2024, Judge Nicholas Thompson sentenced Wade Stephen Wilson to death for both murders. The state attorney's office announced that the sentence followed his June convictions for the murders of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz and related charges, and emphasized that the case was about the victims, not the viral attention surrounding the defendant. And that is the final contrast at the heart of this case. The internet got hung up on the name. The court stayed with the facts. The internet saw Deadpool Killer. The court saw Kristine Melton strangled in her bed. The internet saw facial tattoos and courtroom clips. The court saw Diane Ruiz lured into a car on her way to work and murdered with staggering cruelty. The internet saw a spectacle. The families saw the rest of their lives divided into before and after. As of 2026, Wilson's case remained in the Florida Supreme Court's direct appeal process, with official court information showing the case set for oral argument in February 2026. So legally, the story is still moving. But factually, the essential truth is already fixed. Wilson was convicted of murdering Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, and he was sentenced to death for both killings. And when you strip all the noise away, the nickname, the tattoos, the comparisons, the internet mythology, what remains is brutally simple. A woman met a man at a bar and trusted him. He killed her in her own home. Another woman was walking to work. He tricked her into a car and killed her too. A third woman survived just long enough to expose the violence already in motion. And a father who first thought he was hearing one more twisted story realized he was actually hearing the truth and helped stop his own son before anyone else died. That is the real story of Wade Wilson. Not fiction, not irony, not a comic book coincidence. Just a man who kept getting more violent until 2 women were dead and Florida sentenced him to die for it. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. We truly hope this story mattered to you. And if you'd like to support the channel and help us continue creating content, please like the video, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support really makes a difference, and we genuinely appreciate every person who helps keep these stories from being forgotten.